The screams had stopped hours ago. Now, the only sound was chains. Thousands of iron links scraping against sun-baked stone as an endless column of captives stumbled forward through the Mesopotamian wasteland. Their holy city was gone. Their priests had been gutted in the streets. Their children had been sorted like cattle. The strong ones taken, the rest left to die. And then they saw it. Rising from the flat, cracked earth like a hallucination, the Ishtar Gate. Massive walls sheathed in lapis blue glazed brick, gleaming so violently under the desert sun it almost looked like the sky had been pulled down and bolted to the ground. Beyond it, Babylon, the greatest city the ancient world had ever produced. But every brick in that city had been paid for with someone else's suffering. Every canal, every road, every monument was a receipt for destruction. And at the heart of it all, one man held the leash of the known world. A ruler who could design a masterpiece at sunrise and sign a death warrant by noon. History gave Nebuchadnezzar II the title of visionary. The textbooks celebrate his hanging gardens, that impossible structure of cascading green suspended in the sky above a desert. But underneath that beauty was a machine built on annihilation. He erased kingdoms from the map. He dragged conquered kings before their own people, blinded them, and forced them to listen as their sons were killed one by one. He believed he answered to no one, not men, not gods. But the man who crowned himself divine did not die sitting on his throne. He died on all fours. Naked in an open field, his mind shattered, his fingernails curling into talons, his body matted with filth, tearing at the grass with his teeth like a wild animal. The king of Babylon became a beast, and the empire he built watched it happen in silence. This is the story of the most powerful architect in ancient history, and the madness that swallowed him whole. Before we walk through the gates of Babylon, drop a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to support the channel. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The year was 605 BC, and the ancient world was tearing itself apart. For 300 years, the Assyrian Empire had ruled through pure, systematic brutality. Every nation from Egypt to Persia had bent the knee or been crushed into rubble. But now, the beast was dead. Assyria's capital had been sacked. Its palaces were burning. Its generals were scattered. And in the smoke of that collapse, a power vacuum ripped open across the entire Middle East. A vacuum like that does not last. It gets filled by whoever moves first and hits hardest. Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt saw his chance. He mobilized his entire military force and pushed north, racing to seize the shattered remains of the Assyrian territories before anyone else could claim them. His columns marched along the ancient trade roads, thousands of soldiers glinting under the desert sun, confident that Egypt would inherit the world. They collided with the Babylonian front line at Carchemish, a fortified city sitting right on the western bank of the Euphrates River. And the man commanding that Babylonian force was not yet wearing a crown. He was the eldest son of King Nabopolassar, a prince with something to prove. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. He did not wait for the Egyptians to form ranks. He threw his army across the river and crashed straight into them. The fighting collapsed into close-quarters slaughter. Bronze axes split shields apart. Iron-tipped spears punched through leather armor. The Babylonian infantry carried a weapon specifically engineered for this kind of chaos. The sickle sword, a heavy, curved blade designed to reach over the rim of a shield, hook flesh, and rip downward. One clean pull could take an arm off at the shoulder. The riverbank turned into a killing floor. Blood mixed with the current of the Euphrates until the water ran dark. The Egyptian army did not simply fall back. It shattered. Entire units broke formation and ran south in blind panic, and Nebuchadnezzar did not let them go. He chased the survivors all the way to Hamath and destroyed them there. He hunted down every last fleeing soldier, every officer, every messenger. He made sure that no Egyptian made it home alive. He did not want Pharaoh Necho to receive a battlefield report. He wanted silence. He wanted the absence of an entire army to deliver the message for him. At 20-something years old, the prince already understood a principle most kings never learn: that real victory is not about winning a battle. It is about making sure no one is left to tell the other side of the story. While Nebuchadnezzar was still washing Egyptian blood off his weapons somewhere in Syria, a rider came galloping into camp with a sealed message from Babylon. His father, Nabopolassar, was dead. The throne was empty. In the ancient world, an empty throne is not an opportunity. It is a countdown to assassination. If a brother or an uncle or a military commander reaches the palace first, the rightful heir does not get exiled. He gets executed. His body gets dumped in a canal, and a new dynasty begins before sunrise. Nebuchadnezzar did the math instantly. He abandoned his entire army in the field. He handpicked the fastest riders and the lightest horses in his cavalry, and he launched himself east across the open Syrian desert. No supply wagons, no infantry support, no safe route. Just hundreds of miles of flat, scorched wasteland with no reliable water and hostile tribes on every horizon. Horses dropped dead from heat and exhaustion along the way. Riders fell behind and were left where they collapsed. He covered the distance in days. He blasted through the gates of Babylon, walked straight into the throne room, and placed the crown on his own head before a single rival even knew he had left Syria. Nebuchadnezzar II was now the undisputed ruler of the most powerful empire on the face of the earth. He was 29 years old. Now, to understand everything that came after, you need to understand one fundamental truth about how ancient empires actually work. You do not build a golden age through agriculture. You do not fund monumental construction with barley harvests and pottery sales. You build it by taking everything from someone else: stone, timber, gold, and above all, human labor. Nebuchadnezzar looked west, toward the Mediterranean coast, toward the smaller kingdoms that sat directly on top of his supply lines. The kingdom of Judah was one of them. A modest nation wedged between great powers, surviving by paying tribute to Babylon. Wagons of silver, grain, and livestock rolling east every season in exchange for not being destroyed. It was a simple arrangement. You pay, you live. In 597 BC, King Jehoiakim of Judah stopped paying. He had been in secret contact with Egypt. He believed Pharaoh would send an army north to shield him. He gambled his crown, his people, and his bloodline on that belief. He was wrong. The Babylonian war machine activated, and it did not move like a tribal raiding force or a disorganized horde. It moved like an industrial operation. Military engineers surveyed and cleared the roads ahead of the main column. Quartermasters calculated grain rations down to the last sack. Archers carried composite bows, layered constructions of animal horn, flexible wood, and braided sinew. Weapons accurate and lethal at over 200 yards. The army arrived at the walls of Jerusalem. And they did not charge. They encircled the city, sealed every gate, cut every road, and stopped every food shipment from getting in. Then they waited. They let starvation do the killing for them. Jehoiachin held out for a few months. Then he opened the gates. He surrendered everything: his crown, his family, his mother, his wives, his freedom. Nebuchadnezzar did not burn the city. Not this time. He had something more calculated in mind. He marched into the Temple of Solomon, the spiritual center of the Jewish world, and his soldiers stripped it. They peeled gold off the doors. They seized the sacred silver vessels. They emptied the treasury down to the last coin. Then came the real extraction. His officers moved through the population with lists. They did not round up everyone. They left behind the poor, the elderly, the sick, the farmers, anyone without a useful skill. They took the engineers, the metalworkers, the architects, the scribes, the young nobles, the educated. 10,000 of the sharpest minds in an entire generation were placed in chains and force-marched 800 miles east, across open desert to Babylon. This was not random violence. This was a calculated intellectual amputation. Nebuchadnezzar cut out the brain of Judah and transplanted it into his own empire. He left behind a hollowed-out shell, a kingdom with no capacity to rebuild, no capacity to resist, no capacity to even imagine resistance. He placed a puppet on the throne of Jerusalem, a man named Zedekiah. He forced Zedekiah to swear an oath of absolute obedience, and Zedekiah swore that oath in the name of his own God. Back in Babylon, the stolen workforce was absorbed into the most ambitious construction program the ancient world had ever seen. Nebuchadnezzar was transforming his capital into something beyond a city. He was building a fortress on a scale that defied reason. The outer defensive walls were 80 feet thick, wide enough for 2 war chariots, each pulled by a team of 4 horses, to pass side by side on top of the ramparts without their wheels touching. The bricks were not ordinary sun-dried mud. They were kiln-fired at extreme temperatures and sealed together with boiling bitumen, natural tar hauled in from petroleum seeps deep in the desert. And every single one of those bricks was stamped, millions of them. Pressed into the wet clay before firing, every brick bore the same inscription: Nebuchadnezzar, King of Babylon, who provides for Esagila and Ezida, the eldest son of Nabopolassar, King of Babylon, am I. He literally embedded his identity into the physical structure of the earth. He forced the men he had conquered to spend their remaining years pressing his name into mud with their bare hands. The labor was murderous. Slaves carried buckets of molten bitumen through the blistering Mesopotamian heat. The fumes burned their eyes blind. The weight of wet clay warped their spines over months until they could no longer stand upright. When a man collapsed, he was dragged aside like a broken tool, and the next body stepped into his place. The great ziggurat at Temenanki rose 300 feet above the flat plains, a solid mountain of fired brick climbing toward the sky. It demanded the labor of tens of thousands of human beings. Most scholars believe this exact structure became the foundation for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. It was not just a temple, it was a declaration that one man could stack the earth high enough to touch the realm of the gods. While the king stacked bricks toward heaven, the western provinces burned. In 589 BC, Zedekiah broke his oath. He had been in secret negotiations with a new Egyptian pharaoh. He stopped the tribute payments. He declared independence. When word reached Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar did not delegate the response. He assembled his army personally. He rode west himself. And this time, there would be no partial punishment, no selective deportation, no puppet replacement. He intended to delete Judah from existence. The Babylonian army surrounded Jerusalem for the second time. This siege lasted 18 months, a year and a half of total isolation. Inside the walls, the food supply collapsed within months. The population ate every animal they could find: horses, dogs, cats. They boiled leather from their own armor and shields. And then, according to the first-hand accounts left by survivors, mothers cooked their own children to keep themselves alive. Disease swept through the overcrowded streets. The dead piled up along the walls because no one had the strength to bury them. The city became an open grave. Outside, the Babylonian engineers built siege ramps. They felled every tree for miles in every direction, stripping the landscape down to bare dirt. They piled timber and compacted earth against the base of the walls, raising the ramps inch by inch, day after day. The defenders poured boiling oil from the battlements. They fired arrows until they ran out. They hurled stones by hand. But the Babylonian machine did not pause. The ramps kept rising. In the summer of 587 BC, the wall gave way. Babylonian soldiers surged through the breach with iron swords and heavy axes. The killing inside was indiscriminate. Soldiers, civilians, elderly, children. The narrow streets filled with smoke from burning homes and the sound of a civilization ending. Zedekiah attempted to escape. Under cover of darkness, he slipped out through a small gate near the royal gardens and ran east toward the Jordan Valley. He made it as far as the plains outside Jericho before Babylonian cavalry units ran him down. They locked him in bronze chains and dragged him north. They brought the captured king to a place called Riblah, where Nebuchadnezzar had established his forward command post. Picture this scene. The conqueror is seated on a field throne beneath a military canopy. Dust hangs in the air. The rebel king is forced to his knees in front of him. Nebuchadnezzar does not raise his voice. He gives a single, quiet command. Soldiers drag Zedekiah's sons forward, young men, heirs to the throne of Judah, and force their father to watch as executioners cut them down, one after the other, right there in the dirt. The moment the last son stopped breathing, guards seized Zedekiah's skull and locked it in place. A soldier stepped forward, holding a bronze instrument heated in a fire. He drove it into the king's eyes. This was the surgical precision of Nebuchadnezzar's cruelty. He destroyed Zedekiah's vision at the exact moment that guaranteed the slaughter of his sons would be the final image seared into his brain for the rest of his life. There would be no new memories, no new sights, just that scene, replaying in permanent darkness until the day he died. Zedekiah was thrown into a cage, hauled to Babylon, and left to rot in a cell. He never saw daylight again. Back in Jerusalem, a commander named Nebuzaradan carried out the final orders. He entered the Temple of Solomon, the most sacred structure in the Jewish world, and burned it to its foundations. The colossal bronze pillars known as Boaz and Jachin were smashed apart. The holy instruments were melted down or carried away. The city walls were torn apart, stone by stone. Jerusalem was reduced to a scorched, empty crater. The survivors, thousands of men, women, and children, were chained in long columns and marched east. The death march to Babylon. Anyone who stumbled, anyone who slowed the line, was killed on the spot and left for the birds. But Nebuchadnezzar was not finished. He turned his gaze to the coast of the Mediterranean. The island fortress of Tyre floated just offshore, an arrogant jewel of Phoenician commerce, surrounded by deep water and fortified walls, supplied endlessly by its merchant fleet. The rulers of Tyre had watched Babylon crush every nation on the mainland, and they laughed. No land army could touch them. They had the sea. Nebuchadnezzar marched his forces to the shoreline and ordered the impossible. In 585 BC, his engineers began constructing a causeway, a solid land bridge of stone and rubble, straight out through the open water toward the island. They dumped thousands of tons of rock into the sea. The currents swallowed it. They dumped more. Ancient sources record that the soldiers who carried earth and stone on their heads for years went completely bald from the friction, and the skin on their shoulders was ground down to raw bone. The siege of Tyre lasted 13 years, over a decade of men standing on a shoreline, hauling rocks into the waves, absorbing arrow fire from the island walls. Entire generations of soldiers grew old and died on that beach. The stubbornness of it was almost inhuman. When Tyre finally negotiated a surrender in 573 BC, the Babylonians found almost nothing of value inside. The Phoenician merchants had loaded their wealth onto ships and sailed it away years earlier. Nebuchadnezzar had burned 13 years and thousands of lives to conquer an empty shell. But the point was never the gold. The point was the message. You do not defy Babylon. Ever. He returned to his capital and poured himself into the one thing that gave his existence meaning: construction. Years earlier, he had married a princess from Media, a rugged mountainous kingdom to the northeast. Her name was Amytis. The ancient accounts say she was deeply unhappy in Babylon. She had grown up surrounded by green hills, cool forests, and flowing streams. The endless, flat, sun-blasted plains of Mesopotamia made her feel like she was slowly suffocating. Most rulers would have bought her something: silks, jewels, servants. Nebuchadnezzar decided to reshape geography. This was the origin of the Hanging Gardens. Not a garden in any ordinary sense. It was a vertical forest, engineered from nothing in the middle of a desert. He ordered his architects to design a stepped structure of massive stone and fired brick, rising high above the palace complex. Each terrace was supported by pillars thick enough to hold the weight of saturated earth and full-grown trees. The waterproofing alone was a feat of ancient genius. The engineers laid thick mats of woven reeds sealed with hot tar across each level. Over that, 2 full courses of baked brick. Over that, sheets of hammered lead. Only then did they pack the terraces with enough soil to sustain deep root systems. Date palms, fig trees, exotic flowering plants imported from every corner of the empire. But the real engineering miracle was the water. How do you irrigate a forest suspended in the sky in the middle of a desert with 0 rainfall? The Euphrates River flowed past the base of the complex. The king's engineers designed a chain pump system buried deep in the substructure. Slaves worked in shifts around the clock, turning enormous wooden wheels connected to looped chains of clay buckets. The buckets dipped into the river, filled, and were hauled upward through the interior of the building to the highest terrace. From there, the water flowed downward through channels and cascades, feeding every level on its way back to the ground. The sound must have been relentless. Deep below the gardens, in near total darkness, men shattered their bodies, turning those wheels hour after hour, day after day, year after year. Their hands fused into the shape of the wooden handles. Their spines curved permanently forward. Above them, separated by a few dozen feet of stone and lead, the Queen of Babylon strolled through shaded walkways beneath the canopy of imported trees, listening to artificial waterfalls, breathing air cooled by engineered moisture in the middle of a wasteland. That contrast was the entire philosophy of the Babylonian Empire compressed into a single structure. impossible beauty, built on invisible, systematic suffering. He did not stop with the gardens. He paved the great processional way with slabs of white limestone and imported red breccia stone. He lined the walls of this sacred corridor with 120 life-sized reliefs of roaring lions, molded from glazed brick, their manes and muscles gleaming in gold and blue. Anyone who walked that road toward the Ishtar Gate did so under the gaze of predators frozen mid-stride. The Ishtar Gate itself was dedicated to the goddess of both war and desire. Its surface was coated in deep lapis lazuli glaze, shimmering an unearthly blue against the beige monotony of the desert. Golden reliefs of dragons and bulls marched in rows across its face. He rebuilt and expanded the temples of Marduk, the supreme patron deity of Babylon. He covered their inner chambers with plates of hammered gold. He inscribed his accomplishments on cylinders of baked clay and buried them in the foundations of every major building he erected. Messages to future kings, planted like seeds in the earth, ensuring that whoever dug down thousands of years from now would find his name first. He was not building a city. He was building a monument to himself that he intended to outlast time. If what you have heard so far has pulled you in, then you already understand what this channel is about. You are not here for the polished version. You are here for the full picture. The beauty and the horror, the genius and the madness. If you are one of us, I am inviting you to join The Lineage, our channel membership. Click the join button below. You are not just watching history. You are becoming part of the team that keeps these deep investigations alive. The algorithm rewards the safe and the sanitized. The Lineage keeps this channel running. It keeps the truth uncut. You get exclusive perks, early access to content, and a badge of honor in the comments section. Join us. Keep the fire burning. The captives from Judah had arrived in Babylon years before. They had walked through the Ishtar Gate in chains, staring up at the blue glazed walls and the golden beasts frozen in mid-stride. They had seen the ziggurat piercing the sky. They had heard the grinding of the chain pumps beneath the gardens, and they had wept by the rivers of Babylon, mourning a homeland that no longer existed. Nebuchadnezzar had won everything. No army on earth could challenge him. No city could resist him. No king dared speak his name without bowing. He walked the rooftop terraces of his palace at night, gazing out over the torch-lit expanse of the greatest city ever built. And he believed, with absolute certainty, that he had risen above the limits of mortal men. But something had already begun to shift behind his eyes. It started with small things. A flicker at the edge of his vision that vanished when he turned his head. A tremor in his writing hand that came and went without pattern. A growing, irrational suspicion that the stone lions lining the processional way were turning their heads to watch him pass. Then came the night that broke him. The king retired to his chambers, a room plated in gold, draped in Tyrian purple, cooled by servants fanning perfumed air, and fell asleep. He woke in the dead of night, gasping, drenched in sweat, his pulse hammering so violently he could feel it in his teeth. He had seen something in his sleep, something enormous, something alive, a vision so vast and so terrifying that it pressed against the walls of his sanity like floodwater against a cracking dam. But the moment his eyes opened, the images dissolved. The terror remained, thick, physical, suffocating. But the dream itself was gone, erased, as if something had reached into his skull and pulled it out. He could not sleep again. He paced the corridors until dawn, and by morning he had summoned every sorcerer, astrologer, dream interpreter, and magician in the Babylonian Empire, to the throne room. They stood before him, the most educated, most feared spiritual elite of the ancient world. And the king gave them a command that froze the blood in their veins. He told them to reveal the contents of his dream, not to interpret a dream he would describe to them, to tell him what he had dreamed, to reach into his unconscious mind and extract the images he himself could no longer access. And if they failed, every last one of them, he would have them dismembered and their homes reduced to rubble. The wise men stared at each other in silence. No human being could do what the king demanded. They were already dead. Until a young captive from the ruins of Judah stepped forward, a prisoner who claimed he could see what no sorcerer could, not because of any spell or star chart, but because he served a god who did not live inside a statue. The throne room of Babylon was not a place built for conversation. It was a place built for submission. A long, windowless corridor of glazed brick stretching deep into the palace interior, lined on both sides with molded lions frozen mid-stride in blue and amber clay. Torchlight moved across their surfaces, giving the illusion that they were breathing. At the far end of this corridor, elevated on a platform of polished stone, sat a chair made of solid gold. And in that chair sat the man who owned the known world. Surrounding him stood the most powerful intellectual class in Mesopotamian civilization: the Chaldeans, the court astrologers, the Magi. These were not carnival tricksters or street corner fortune tellers. These were men who had charted the orbits of planets visible to the naked eye, predicted lunar eclipses with mathematical precision, and authored the vast libraries of omen literature that dictated the political and spiritual decisions of every ruler in the region. They answered to no one but the king himself. Their authority was enormous, and on this particular morning, every single one of them was shaking. Nebuchadnezzar had been consumed by his vanished dream. He had called them all before him and issued a demand that violated every known boundary of their craft. They were not being asked to interpret a vision. They were being ordered to reconstruct one, to reach into the sealed vault of the king's unconscious mind and extract images that even he could no longer access. The chief sorcerer attempted diplomacy. He stepped forward and spoke carefully. He reminded the king that no ruler in all of recorded history had ever demanded such a thing from any astrologer or diviner. He argued that only the gods themselves possessed the ability to reveal hidden thoughts, and the gods did not walk among mortal men. It was a reasonable defense, a rational appeal to the limits of human knowledge. It was also the worst thing he could have said. Nebuchadnezzar did not operate within the boundaries of reason. He operated within the boundaries of power, and power does not negotiate with its instruments. It uses them or it discards them. He gave the signal. Guards stepped forward and drew their blades. The king issued a formal decree, not a threat, not a warning, but a binding legal order to execute every wise man in the city of Babylon. And Babylonian execution was not a euphemism. The prescribed method was dismemberment, heavy bronze cleavers. The bodies were to be cut into sections. Afterward, the soldiers would march to the homes of the condemned, tear the structures down to their foundations, and convert the rubble into public waste pits. The scholars would not just die. They would be deleted. Every trace of their existence scraped off the face of the earth. The execution squads fanned out into the city. They moved through the residential quarters of the intellectual class, pulling men from their homes. One of the names on that list belonged to a young deportee from the kingdom of Judah. His birth name was Daniel. His Babylonian handlers had renamed him Belteshazzar as part of a systematic cultural erasure program applied to every high-value captive. He had been taken from Jerusalem during the first wave of deportation in 605 BC, selected as a teenager for his intelligence, and subjected to years of intensive indoctrination in Chaldean literature, language, mathematics, and court protocol. He understood the internal mechanics of the Babylonian power structure better than most native-born officials. When the captain of the royal guard appeared at his door with a blade and a warrant, Daniel did not collapse. He did not beg. He asked a single question: whether the king would grant him one night. One night to seek an answer from a source the Chaldeans had never consulted. The captain granted the request. Whether out of pity, curiosity, or bureaucratic hesitation, the execution was paused. The following morning, Daniel walked into the throne room and stood before the man who had ordered his death. He did not open with a claim of personal genius. He did not perform a ritual or consult a star chart. He stated plainly that no human being, no scholar, no sorcerer, no astrologer could do what the king demanded. The mystery could only be unlocked by the God of heaven. And then, standing in the silence of that lethal corridor, he began to speak the images that had been sealed inside the king's shattered sleep. He described an enormous statue, a colossus of terrifying scale and radiance, standing upright in a void. Its body was assembled from different metals, layered from top to bottom in descending order. The head was sculpted from pure, gleaming gold. The chest and both arms were forged from silver. The midsection and upper legs were cast in polished bronze. The lower legs were columns of solid iron. And the feet, the foundation on which the entire figure stood, were an unstable fusion of iron and fired clay. Daniel decoded the metallurgy piece by piece. The sequence of metals descended in monetary value from top to bottom: gold to silver to bronze to iron, but increased in raw hardness and destructive force. The golden head was Nebuchadnezzar himself. The Babylonian Empire, the pinnacle of human civilization as the ancient world understood it. But the gold would not endure. A lesser kingdom of silver would rise after him, then a kingdom of bronze that would extend its dominion across the entire earth. After that, a kingdom of iron, brutal, efficient, crushing everything in its path. But that iron kingdom would fracture, splitting into divisions represented by those feet of mixed iron and clay, a foundation that could not hold, strong material fused with weak material, power married to fragility. And then came the moment that should have rewritten the trajectory of the king's soul. A stone, not quarried by human hands, not shaped by any chisel, not launched by any siege engine, detached itself from the face of a mountain. It flew through the air. It did not strike the golden head. It did not hit the silver chest or the bronze midsection. It bypassed every layer and slammed directly into the feet of iron and clay. The weakest point, the foundation splintered on impact, and the entire statue, every metal, every layer, every empire it represented, came crashing down and disintegrated into particles so fine that the wind lifted them off the ground and scattered them into nothing. Not a fragment remained. The stone that destroyed the colossus then expanded, growing outward in every direction until it became a mountain so vast it covered the entire surface of the earth. The throne room went silent. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of recognition. Every man in that corridor understood that something had just happened that exceeded the boundaries of their entire intellectual tradition. Nebuchadnezzar, the man who knelt before no one, who blinded kings and burned temples and stamped his name into every brick beneath his feet, dropped to his knees. He went further. He pressed his face against the glazed floor before the young prisoner from Judah. He ordered incense and offerings presented to Daniel. He elevated him immediately, making him chief governor over the entire province of Babylon and supreme authority over every surviving wise man in the empire. He declared aloud that Daniel's God was a revealer of mysteries, a God above all gods. He promoted Daniel's 3 companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to senior administrative positions across the province. The execution decree was revoked. The crisis dissolved. But Nebuchadnezzar had absorbed the prophecy through a filter so distorted by narcissism that it inverted the entire meaning. He ignored the stone. He ignored the total annihilation of the statue. He ignored the explicit warning that every human empire, including his own, would eventually be reduced to dust and blown away by forces no king could resist. He heard only 4 words, and he locked onto them with the grip of a man drowning. "You are the head of gold." Years passed. The Babylonian military apparatus continued to operate at full capacity. Conquered territories were stripped of their resources and funneled into the capital. Caravans loaded with silver from the Levant, cedar beams from the mountains of Lebanon, and columns of chained prisoners from every fallen city poured through the Ishtar Gate in an unbroken stream. The king's authority went unchallenged. He was surrounded day and night by men whose survival depended on agreeing with every word he spoke. This is the environment that produces a very specific kind of psychological mutation. The ruler stops distinguishing between himself and the universe. His opinions become physics. His preferences become law. His identity becomes the only reality in the room. The dream of the statue never left him. But it did not humble him. It enraged him. The idea that a silver kingdom would follow his golden one was intolerable. The thought that bronze or iron would inherit his legacy was an insult that festered in his mind for years, so he decided to overwrite the prophecy. If Daniel's vision showed a statue with a golden head and inferior metals below, then the solution was obvious. He would build a statue made entirely of gold. No silver, no bronze, no iron, no clay. Pure, unbroken gold from head to feet. A physical declaration that there would be no successor. That Babylon was eternal. That his empire would never fall. He commissioned the project immediately. His engineers and master metallurgists were given the specifications. The statue would stand 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. The proportions were deliberately abnormal. Not a human figure, but a narrow, towering obelisk. A golden needle piercing the desert sky. The internal structure was almost certainly a massive timber framework sheathed in hammered sheets of gold, smelted from the sacred vessels and treasury reserves of a dozen plundered civilizations. When the desert sun struck that surface, the reflection would have been visible from miles away. A blinding vertical scar on the horizon. He erected it on the plain of Dura, just outside the city walls. And then he summoned the world. Messengers were dispatched to every corner of the empire. Every satrap, every prefect, every governor, every advisor, every treasurer, every judge, every magistrate, every provincial official. The entire administrative skeleton of Babylonian governance was ordered to assemble on the plain. If you held a title, you came. If you were stationed 1,000 miles away, you traveled. Absence was treason. And treason in Babylon had one sentence. Thousands of officials gathered in the flat, baking heat of the Mesopotamian lowlands. They wore the robes and insignia of their offices. They represented dozens of languages, ethnicities, and conquered religions. They stood before the golden column and waited. A royal herald stepped forward, and announced the protocol. When the music played, every person present was to fall to the ground and worship the golden image. The instruments were listed with deliberate specificity: the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, a wall of sound designed as a psychological trigger. The moment the noise hit your ears, your body was expected to collapse in submission. The herald then stated the consequence for non-compliance. Anyone who did not fall and worship would be thrown immediately into a furnace of blazing fire. No deliberation, no defense, no appeal. You bow or you burn. The instruments sounded. The noise rolled across the open plain like a physical wave. Thousands of men hit the dirt. Military commanders who had led armies in battle pressed their foreheads into the dust. Provincial governors who administered entire regions dropped like cut timber. The plain became a carpet of prostrate bodies stretching to the horizon. 3 men did not move. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the Jewish administrators elevated to power through Daniel's influence, remained on their feet, standing upright in the middle of a field of kneeling backs. They did not shout. They did not make a speech. They simply stood. And in the geometry of absolute obedience, a single vertical line among thousands of horizontal ones is the most dangerous shape in the world. The Chaldean astrologers spotted them instantly. These were the same scholars who had nearly lost their heads during the dream crisis, the same men who watched with burning resentment as foreign captives from a destroyed nation were promoted above them. They had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. They walked straight to the king and filed a formal accusation. They reminded Nebuchadnezzar of his own decree. They pointed at the 3 men still standing. The king detonated. His pride was not a personality trait. It was a chemical compound, and the slightest friction could trigger an explosion. He ordered the 3 men dragged before him. He gave them one last chance. He asked them directly, what god could possibly rescue them from his hand? Their response was not a negotiation. It was not a plea. They looked into the face of the most powerful human being on the planet and told him their God was fully capable of saving them from any furnace he could build. But even if he chose not to, even if the flames consumed them, they would never serve his gods, and they would never bow before his golden statue. The king's expression contorted into something unrecognizable. He lost control of his own composure. He screamed for the furnace to be heated to 7 times its standard operating temperature. Consider what that furnace actually was. This was not a bonfire or a pit. It was a full-scale industrial brick kiln. Babylon's entire infrastructure depended on fired brick, millions upon millions of them, and the kilns used to produce them at that volume were enormous domed structures with a loading port at the top and an access hatch at the base. They were fueled with crude petroleum, pitch, and naphtha that seeped naturally from underground deposits across the Mesopotamian basin. At normal operating temperatures, they could fire clay to stone hardness. At 7 times intensity, the fuel load would have transformed the interior into a furnace approaching the thermal output of molten metal. The king selected the strongest soldiers in his personal guard. They bound the 3 men hand and foot, leaving them fully dressed in their official robes, trousers, and head coverings. Then they hauled them up the earthen ramp toward the top loading port of the kiln. The physics of what happened next require no exaggeration. As the soldiers climbed the ramp and approached the vent opening, the ambient air temperature escalated beyond human tolerance within seconds. The superheated updraft from inside the kiln hit them before they reached the edge. They inhaled. The air scorched the lining of their lungs instantly. Their respiratory systems failed. They collapsed dead on the ramp, killed by the radiant heat alone. Their forward momentum carried the three bound captives over the lip, and they dropped into the white core of the blaze. Nebuchadnezzar watched from a safe vantage point near the base hatch. He waited for the bodies to disintegrate. Instead, he leaped to his feet, his face drained of color. He turned to his advisors and asked them, urgently, almost desperately, to confirm that 3 men had been bound and thrown in. They confirmed it. He pointed at the open hatch. Inside the blinding white inferno, 4 figures were visible. They were upright. They were unbound. They were walking calmly through the center of the fire. They were not screaming. Their skin was not burning. Their clothing was not smoldering. And the 4th figure, the one who had not been thrown in, radiated something the king could only describe as resembling a divine being. Something cracked inside the architecture of the tyrant's mind. He had burned nations. He had destroyed the holiest structure in the Jewish world. He had engineered wonders that bent the laws of nature. He controlled the fate of millions, but he could not burn 3 men who refused to kneel. He moved toward the hatch, fighting against the wall of heat radiating from the opening, and shouted for them to come out. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walked out of the fire and into the daylight. The entire assembly of officials surrounded them. They examined the men with their own hands. The hair on their heads was completely intact. Their robes showed no scorch marks. Their skin carried no burns. There was not even the faint scent of smoke on their bodies. The only thing the fire had destroyed were the ropes that had been used to bind them. Nebuchadnezzar issued a public declaration acknowledging the supremacy of their God. He praised the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before the entire gathered administration of his empire. He promoted the 3 men to even higher positions within the provincial government. But watch carefully what he did next, because it reveals the core of the man more clearly than any battle or building project. He did not repent. He did not change. He did not experience a transformation of character. He simply recognized a weapon more powerful than his own and responded the only way he knew how. He issued a new decree, identical in structure to every other decree he had ever issued, declaring that any person of any nation, speaking any language, who said a single word against the God of these 3 men would be dismembered and their home demolished. The exact same punishment template. The exact same machinery of terror. He simply redirected it. His operating system had not been updated. Only the target coordinates had changed. Decades ground forward. The empire reached an apex of wealth and territorial control that no Mesopotamian state had ever approached. But the deeper the power sank into the king's bones, the more unstable the ground beneath him became. The Medes were consolidating to the north and east. Their cavalry was growing. Their ambitions were sharpening. Nebuchadnezzar could feel the pressure building beyond his borders. His response was the response of every aging autocrat who senses the world closing in. He built more walls. He constructed the Median Wall, a massive barrier of brick and earth stretching across the open desert between the Euphrates and the Tigris, designed to physically block any northern army from reaching his capital. He reinforced the inner city defenses. He added layer after layer of fortification around the palace complex. He was sealing himself inside a cocoon of stone and paranoia. He paced the ramparts of his palace. He gazed out over the terraced gardens, the great ziggurat clawing at the sky, the endless geometric grid of blue-glazed walls. He breathed in the smell of bitumen and river water and burning cedar. He felt untouchable. Then the second dream arrived. It was more disturbing than the first. He saw a tree growing from the center of the earth. It grew without limit, taller, wider, stronger, until its crown brushed the sky and its branches could be seen from the farthest edge of the known world. Its leaves were lush, its fruit was infinite. Every living creature on earth drew sustenance from it. Animals sheltered in its shade. Birds nested in its highest branches. It was the source of all life. It was everything. Then a figure descended from the sky, a watcher, a holy messenger, and the watcher issued a command that turned the vision into a nightmare. Cut the tree down, sever its branches, strip its leaves, scatter its fruit, drive the animals away from beneath it and the birds from its limbs, but do not pull the stump from the ground. Leave the roots buried in the earth, bound with a ring of iron and bronze, standing in the open grass of the field. And then the language of the decree shifted, from the metaphor of a tree to the diagnosis of a man. Let him be soaked with the dew of the open sky. Let him live among the animals in the wild grass. Let his human mind be taken from him and replaced with the mind of a beast. And let 7 periods of time pass over him in that state. The king woke drenched in terror. He called for his astrologers. They stood before him and failed. Again. Finally, Daniel was summoned. When Daniel heard the dream, he stopped speaking. The text records that he stood in silence for a full hour, visibly disturbed. His own thoughts horrified him. He understood every detail of the vision with perfect clarity, and he knew exactly what it meant. He also knew that delivering this interpretation to a paranoid autocrat surrounded by armed guards was functionally identical to signing his own execution order. The king noticed his hesitation and urged him to speak freely. Daniel looked at the man who had razed his homeland, burned his temple, and marched his people across a desert in chains. And what he said next was not the words of a man seeking revenge. It was the words of a man who, against all logic, still hoped the destroyer could be saved. My lord, I wish this dream were meant for your enemies. He delivered the interpretation without softening it. The tree was the king. His power had grown until it overshadowed the entire earth. But a decree had been passed by the highest authority in existence, and it could not be appealed. Nebuchadnezzar was going to be expelled from human civilization. He would live in the open wilderness among wild animals. He would eat grass from the ground like an ox. His body would be drenched by rain and dew. And this condition would persist for 7 full years, until the moment he acknowledged, in the shattered remains of his mind, that it was heaven, and not any man, that determined who ruled the kingdoms of the earth. The stump left in the ground, bound by iron and bronze, meant his throne would be preserved. His kingdom would survive and be returned to him, but only after his pride had been dismantled completely, piece by piece, from the inside out. Daniel pleaded with him. He urged the king to change course, to renounce the cruelty, to release the oppressed, to use his power for something other than self-glorification. He begged for behavioral change as the only possible route to averting what was coming. The king heard every word. He dismissed Daniel, and then he returned to his life exactly as it was. He reviewed military deployments. He inspected construction projects. He approved tribute inventories. He admired the golden surfaces of his monuments and saw his own face reflected back. The warning from the watcher dissolved into the background radiation of an existence so saturated with power that even divine threats lost their weight. The ego of an absolute ruler is not a personality flaw. It is a fortress. It has walls thicker than anything Nebuchadnezzar ever built in brick. It deflects every piece of evidence that contradicts the central myth. It absorbs praise and repels warning with equal mechanical efficiency. It does not process vulnerability. It deletes it. If what you are hearing right now has locked you in, if you came to this channel not for the polished version of history, but for the raw, unfiltered anatomy of power, madness, and collapse, then you understand what we are building here. I am inviting you to join The Lineage, our channel membership. Click the Join button below this video. You are not a passive viewer. You are part of the infrastructure that keeps this work alive. The algorithm pushes safe content to the surface and buries everything else. The Lineage is what keeps this channel producing deep, uncut investigations into the darkest corridors of the past. You get exclusive access, early content drops, and a permanent badge in the comments that marks you as one of us. Join us. Keep the fire lit. 12 months passed. The warning was a year old. The fear had evaporated completely. Nebuchadnezzar was standing on the rooftop terrace of the royal palace. It was the highest occupied point in the city. Only the peak of the great ziggurat rose above him. He looked south and saw the smoke curling from the brick kilns along the river. He looked west and saw the Ishtar Gate shimmering blue and gold in the afternoon light. He looked north and saw the processional corridor lined with its frozen, roaring lions. He looked down and saw the Euphrates cutting through the grid of his capital like a vein of molten silver. The entire panorama of his life's work was spread beneath him, and the silence was absolute. No enemy marching on the horizon, no rival whispering in the corridors, no prophet standing behind him with a warning. Just the hot wind and the hum of a city running on the labor of 100,000 souls. The pride swelled in his chest like a wave building offshore. It rose through his throat, and it came out of his mouth as the last fully human sentence he would ever speak. Is this not the great Babylon that I have built as a royal residence by the force of my power and for the magnificence of my glory? The final syllable had not yet faded from the air. The sound was still traveling across the rooftop, still vibrating between the palace walls. And then a voice descended from above, not from behind the walls, not from the corridors, from the sky itself. And the words did not drift. They struck with the force of a sentence being carved into stone in real time. This is what has been decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your authority over this kingdom is removed from you. You will be cast out from the company of men. You will dwell among the wild animals of the field. You will eat grass from the earth like an ox. And 7 seasons will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High holds dominion over every kingdom of men, and grants it to whomever he chooses. There was no transition, no slow decline, no gradual unraveling of the mind over weeks or months. It happened in a single, violent rupture. One heartbeat, Nebuchadnezzar was standing on the polished rooftop of his palace, draped in Tyrian purple, surveying an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. The next heartbeat, the architecture of his higher brain collapsed. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for language, identity, self-awareness, rational thought, went completely offline. The deeper primitive structures beneath it surged forward and seized control. He dropped, not to his knees in prayer. He dropped onto all fours like a struck animal. His face hit the glazed brick. His jaw opened and a sound came out. Not words, not a scream, but a low, guttural moan. A noise produced by vocal cords that had abandoned human speech. The royal guards posted at the rooftop stairwell heard the impact of a body hitting the floor. They charged upward with weapons drawn, expecting to find an assassination in progress. What they found was the most powerful man in the known world crawling in circles on the terrace, pressing his tongue against the dust on the tiles. When one of the guards reached down to grip his arm, Nebuchadnezzar whipped his head sideways and snapped his teeth at the man's wrist like a cornered dog. The palace plunged into immediate crisis. In the political architecture of the ancient Near East, kingship was a projection of invincibility. If even a rumor escaped that the Babylonian monarch had lost his mind, if a vassal king in the Levant or a tribal warlord in the Zagros highlands caught a single whisper, the entire imperial structure would begin to fracture within days. Rebellions would erupt across 1,000 miles of conquered territory faster than any army could respond. The senior officials and the royal household moved with surgical speed. They cleared the rooftop. They dragged the thrashing, snarling king down the private interior stairways, away from the sight of every servant, every guard, every pair of eyes that could carry a story outside the palace walls. They barricaded him inside his private chambers. The court physicians were summoned immediately. Babylonian medicine was not primitive. It operated from a detailed clinical framework codified in a text called the Diagnostic Handbook, compiled by a scholar named Esagil Kin Apli. The system categorized illness by observable symptoms and assigned each condition to a specific supernatural cause: the anger of a particular deity, the intrusion of a particular demon. The doctors watched the king crawl the perimeter of his gold-plated room on his hands and knees. They watched him reject the platters of roasted lamb and flagons of wine placed before him. They watched him tear strips from the woven reed floor mats and push them into his mouth with both hands, chewing mechanically, his eyes empty of recognition. They classified it as an extreme case of divine possession. They ignited bundles of rare imported incense. They chanted the ritual incantations to Marduk, patron god of Babylon, protector of kings. They slaughtered sacrificial animals and split open the livers with bronze knives, searching the surface for the telltale markings that their omen texts said would identify the source of the affliction. The livers were clean. No marks, no signs. The gods of Babylon returned nothing. The incantations produced nothing. The incense was smoke and fragrance and nothing more. Every tool in the most advanced spiritual and medical system in the ancient world failed completely. The political calculus became unavoidable. They could not heal him. They could not execute him. His name was the structural foundation of the empire. Every treaty, every military alliance, every tribute agreement was bound to his personal authority. Kill the king and the empire dies with him. They chose the only remaining option. They staged the most elaborate cover-up in ancient history. Historical evidence suggests that his son, Amel-Marduk, was installed as a shadow regent, supported by Daniel and the senior court officials. The king's personal cylinder seal, the instrument used to authenticate royal decrees, was used to stamp documents in his name. Orders continued to flow from the palace. Military commanders received their dispatches. Provincial governors received their quotas. The bureaucratic heartbeat of the empire was maintained by a network of men forging the authority of a king who was, at that moment, chewing grass in the dark. Under the cover of a moonless night, they smuggled the crawling monarch out of the city. They transported him to the royal game reserves, massive walled enclosures outside the urban perimeter, originally designed for the king's hunting expeditions. These parks contained dense brush, artificial streams, wild game, and enough open grassland to sustain a large animal population. They released him through a gate and sealed it behind him. He remained in that enclosure for 7 years, 84 months. more than 2,500 days and nights in the open dirt. The condition that consumed him is recognized in modern psychiatric literature as Boanthropy, a rare and severe delusional disorder in which a human being becomes fully convinced that they are a cow or an ox. The patient abandons all human behavior. They shed clothing. They refuse cooked food. They attempt to graze. They avoid human contact with visible fear or aggression. The delusion is total and self-sustaining. To comprehend what 7 years of this meant for the human body, you need to understand the environment. The Mesopotamian plain is not a mild landscape. In the summer months, ground temperatures routinely exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is thick with dust and biting insects. In winter, the nights plunge below freezing, and a bitter wind sweeps unbroken across hundreds of miles of flat terrain with nothing to slow it down. Nebuchadnezzar endured all of this with zero shelter. His royal garments, the embroidered linen, the purple wool, the gold-threaded sash, disintegrated within the first months. Fabric is not designed to survive sustained exposure to rain, mud, sun, and friction against rock. He was naked. The Mesopotamian sun attacked his exposed skin without mercy. Over time, his epidermis responded the only way it could. It thickened. It hardened into a leathery, darkened shell, cracked along the joints, calloused in layers over his kneecaps, his shins, the heels of his hands. The pads where his palms met the ground developed a thickness comparable to the paws of an animal. His body was attempting to adapt to a life it was never designed to live. He ate grass. He chewed roots. He tore wild barley from the ground with his teeth and swallowed it with the dirt still attached. The human digestive system is categorically incapable of processing raw cellulose. We lack the specialized stomach chambers, the bacterial colonies, and the enzymatic pathways that allow cattle to extract nutrition from plant fiber. Every mouthful would have produced violent abdominal cramping. Chronic malnutrition set in and never left. His muscles wasted. His bones weakened. His gums bled from grinding his teeth against sand and silica embedded in the roots. The enamel wore down past the surface, exposing raw nerve. He drank from standing pools of rainwater and runoff, water contaminated with parasites, animal waste, and bacterial cultures that would have produced recurring bouts of dysentery severe enough to kill a healthy man. By every measurable medical standard, he should have been dead within weeks. Exposure alone should have finished him in the first winter. Infection should have killed him by the second month. Starvation should have claimed him long before the first year ended. And yet, he survived. He was sustained, not by any natural resilience, but by the same decree that had condemned him. He was kept alive specifically to suffer the full duration of the sentence. His hair was never cut, never washed, never combed. Rain soaked it. Mud caked into it. Tree sap and his own bodily fluids bonded the strands together into rigid, matted columns. Over months and years, the hair solidified into dense, spike-like formations, hardened shafts of keratin, and filth jutting from his skull. The ancient text describes his hair growing to resemble the plumage of an eagle. Not a poetic flourish, a clinical observation. His hair had ceased to function as hair. It had become a brittle exoskeleton of compacted waste. His fingernails and toenails were never trimmed. Without maintenance, nails do not simply grow longer. They thicken, curve, discolor, and warp. Malnutrition accelerated the deformity. Over 7 years, they extended and curled downward into dense, yellowed hooks, cracking against stones, splitting along the edges, sharp enough to tear skin. They resembled talons. The text compares them to the claws of a bird. Again, not metaphor. Description: this was the king who designed the Hanging Gardens, the man who burned the Temple of Solomon, the ruler who blinded Zedekiah at the precise moment his sons were butchered, so the image would be seared permanently into his dying vision. He was now a filthy, skeletal creature, shivering in the winter mud, tearing wet grass from the dirt with his teeth in the shadow of the very walls he had built. Inside those walls, the empire held its breath and pretended nothing had changed. The slaves still turned the water wheels beneath the gardens. The golden colossus on the plain of Dura still reflected the sun across the horizon. The bureaucratic machinery ground forward, collecting tribute, processing grain shipments, dispatching military units. The golden head of Daniel's statue was face down in a puddle of standing water, gnawing on roots. 7 years passed in that suspended state, and then the appointed time ran out. The text records the moment of restoration with the precision of a medical case file. The account shifts to first person, the only surviving fragment of Nebuchadnezzar's own voice. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored to me. It began with a single physical act. He lifted his head. For 7 years, his gaze had been locked on the ground, scanning the dirt for roots, for grass, for anything his ruined teeth could tear from the earth. His entire existence had been reduced to a downward stare. And then, on one specific day, at one specific hour, something shifted inside the wreckage of his neurological system, and his neck muscles engaged in an upward motion. His eyes found the sky, and in that instant, the shattered circuitry of his higher brain reconnected. The fog dissolved. Human consciousness flooded back into his skull, like water crashing through a broken dam. Try to inhabit that moment. Try to imagine the first seconds of that return. He became aware. He tasted the bitter, fibrous mass of half-chewed weeds packed between his teeth and gums. He felt the cracked, leathery surface of his own skin pulled tight over protruding bones. He felt the cold wind against a body that had not been covered in years. He raised his hands in front of his face and saw the yellowed, curling talons where his fingernails had been. He saw the matted spikes of filth radiating from his skull. He smelled himself. And then, worst of all, he remembered. He remembered the rooftop. He remembered the words. He remembered the voice. He did not curse. He did not rage. The furnace of his arrogance had been burned down to cold ash over 84 months of animal existence. There was nothing left to fuel defiance. The first human words he spoke in 7 years were words of complete and absolute surrender. He praised the Most High. He declared that the dominion of heaven is eternal, that its authority passes from age to age without interruption. He acknowledged that every inhabitant of the earth is counted as nothing before that power, that the God of heaven acts according to his own will among the armies of the sky and the populations of the earth, and no human hand can restrain him, and no human voice can question him. The guards assigned to the perimeter of the enclosure, men tasked for years with nothing more than making sure the creature inside did not escape, heard articulate human speech coming from within the walls. They approached with extreme caution. They found the beast sitting upright. Tears were cutting tracks through the caked filth on his face. He was speaking, clearly, coherently, in the formal register of the Babylonian royal court. A rider was dispatched to the palace at full speed. The senior advisors and nobles mounted their horses and rode to the game reserve. They found their king. The restoration of his body took time. Servants worked in shifts. They soaked his skin in warm water to soften the layers of encrusted dirt and dead tissue. They used sharp bronze implements to cut away the solidified mass of his hair. They filed and carved the overgrown claws back to something approximating human nails. They rubbed olive oil and perfumed ointments into the cracked, scarred terrain of his skin. They dressed him in fresh linen. They slid the royal signet ring back onto a finger that had spent 7 years gripping wet earth. He returned to the throne room. He sat on the golden chair. His nobles knelt before him. His authority was formally restored. The bureaucratic fiction that had sustained the empire in his absence was quietly dissolved, and the real king resumed command. But the man who sat on that throne was not the same organism that had left it. He was a king who had been autopsied while still alive. He had experienced the total dissolution of his own identity and survived it. He knew, not as a theological concept, not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a lived, physical, 7-year-long experience burned into every nerve ending in his body, that every wall he had ever built, every army he had ever commanded, every golden surface he had ever polished could be rendered meaningless by a single sentence spoken from above. And then he did something that no autocrat in the ancient world had ever done before, something that violated every principle of royal propaganda, every instinct of self-preservation, every rule of imperial communication. He told the truth. He ordered his scribes to compose a formal decree documenting the entire episode. The dream, the warning, the madness, the degradation, the years of crawling naked in the dirt, eating grass, growing claws, the restoration. He held nothing back. He did not sanitize the narrative. He did not frame it as a heroic trial or a voluntary spiritual retreat. He described, in explicit and humiliating detail, the complete destruction of his dignity as a human being. And then he sent the document to every nation, every people, every language group in his empire. He broadcast his own annihilation to the entire known world. He handed his enemies the most damaging intelligence any ruler could provide. Proof that the king of Babylon had been reduced to an animal and had spent 7 years eating grass in a fenced enclosure outside his own capital. He closed the decree with a single warning, the last recorded words of Nebuchadnezzar II in any historical or scriptural source. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of Heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride he is able to humble. He did not live long after his restoration. The exact duration is disputed among historians, but he died around 562 BC. His body was exhausted, ravaged by 7 years of exposure, malnutrition, and psychological trauma layered on top of decades of relentless military campaigning and the cumulative stress of absolute power. He died in his bed. His body was prepared according to Babylonian royal custom, embalmed, wrapped in aromatic spices, and sealed inside a stone sarcophagus within the palace complex. The instant his heart stopped, the countdown began. The prophecy of the metal statue activated. His son, Amel-Marduk, inherited the throne. He did not inherit his father's gravitational force. He ruled for 2 years before being murdered by his own brother-in-law, a general named Neriglissar. The royal court collapsed into a cycle of conspiracy and assassination. Neriglissar himself died shortly after seizing power. His young son was dragged from the throne and beaten to death by a coalition of conspirators. A man named Nabonidus, a scholar with no military credentials and no blood connection to the dynasty, seized control of the empire by force. Nabonidus proved to be the worst possible steward of a crumbling superpower. He alienated the priesthood of Marduk, the single most powerful religious institution in Babylon, by promoting the worship of a rival deity. Then he abandoned the capital entirely, relocating to an oasis settlement deep in the Arabian desert called Tema, where he lived for a decade pursuing archaeological and religious obsessions. He left his son, Belshazzar, in charge of Babylon. The empire was hemorrhaging from within, and to the east the kingdom of silver was sharpening its blade. Cyrus the Great, king of the Medes and Persians, had been methodically absorbing every neighboring power into a single, unified military force. He conquered Lydia. He consumed the kingdoms of Asia Minor. He consolidated an army of staggering size and pointed it directly at the heart of Mesopotamia. In 539 BC, his forces arrived at the outskirts of Babylon. Belshazzar looked out from behind the walls his grandfather had engineered and felt safe. The fortifications were 80 feet thick. The storehouses held enough grain and supplies to outlast a siege of 20 years. The Euphrates River flowed directly through the center of the city, passing beneath the walls through fortified channels, an inexhaustible water supply that no external army could cut off. The city was, by every known metric of ancient military science, impregnable. On the night the Persian army encircled the walls, Belshazzar threw a feast. 1,000 of his nobles filled the banquet hall, and in a final act of arrogance that mirrored his grandfather's rooftop declaration, he ordered the servants to bring out the golden and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem decades earlier. They drank wine from the sacred cups of a destroyed god. That night, in the middle of the feast, a disembodied hand materialized in the torchlight and began writing on the plaster wall of the banquet hall. The fingers moved with deliberate precision. The room went silent. The king's face went white. His knees buckled. His legs gave out beneath him. Daniel, now an elderly man, a survivor of the entire Babylonian arc from deportation to this final hour, was brought before the trembling king. He read the inscription. The message was 4 words long. The kingdom had been weighed, measured, and found insufficient. It was finished. It would be divided and handed to the Medes and the Persians. Outside the walls, Cyrus did not waste a single soldier against those 80-foot fortifications. He did not build ramps. He did not construct siege towers. He looked at the river. He ordered his engineers to excavate massive diversion channels upstream from the city. Under cover of darkness, they broke open the earthen barriers and redirected the flow of the Euphrates into a nearby marshland. The river level inside the city dropped silently, inch by inch, hour by hour. The guards stationed at the riverside gates, distracted by the noise of the feast echoing from the palace, did not notice the water receding beneath their feet. The Persian heavy infantry entered the riverbed in formation. They marched in disciplined silence through the mud, directly beneath the walls that had been designed to stop every army on earth. They passed through the river gates, iron grates that had been left open in the chaos and negligence of the celebration, and emerged inside the city without a single blade having struck a single wall. They stormed the palace. Belshazzar was killed before dawn. The Babylonian Empire, the golden head of the statue, the mightiest civilization the ancient Near East had ever produced, fell in a single night without a siege, without a battle, without a single crack appearing in its legendary walls. It was devoured from within. The kingdom of silver took control, and the rest of the statue followed. The silver of Persia gave way to the bronze of Greece under Alexander. The bronze gave way to the iron of Rome. The iron fractured into the mixed clay and metal of divided kingdoms that have defined the political landscape of the Western world ever since. Every layer of the colossus that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream has materialized across the centuries, exactly as described, in exactly the sequence predicted. By a captive Jewish teenager standing in a throne room in Babylon 2,600 years ago. The hanging gardens are gone. Without the slave labor to operate the chain pumps, the water stopped flowing within years of the empire's fall. The imported trees and exotic plants died in the desert heat. The lead waterproofing buckled. The terraces crumbled inward. The greatest botanical achievement in human history returned to dust. The great ziggurat at Etemenenki, the Tower of Babel, was dismantled by successive conquerors and eroded by centuries of wind and neglect until nothing remained but a waterlogged foundation pit. The processional way was buried under meters of wind-blown sand. The glazed lions disappeared beneath the dirt. The Ishtar Gate vanished from human memory for over 2,000 years, until German archaeologists excavated it in the early 20th century. The millions of stamped bricks, every one of them bearing the name of Nebuchadnezzar, were scavenged by local populations across the centuries to build farmhouses, irrigation walls, and animal pens. The name of the king of the world was repurposed as building material for goat enclosures. Nebuchadnezzar pursued immortality through two instruments: violence and architecture. He burned civilizations to fuel his construction. He enslaved entire populations to stamp his name into clay. He built a city designed to survive the end of time. But the earth does not negotiate with human ambition. It reclaims everything. Every monument, every wall, every name. Today, the ruins of Babylon are a low mound of broken clay and eroded mud brick sitting in the flat, featureless terrain south of Baghdad. Tourists walk across the rubble. Dust blows through the outlines of foundations that once held the most magnificent structures the ancient world had ever seen. The conqueror is gone. The beast is gone. The golden head is powder. Only the warning survives. Thank you for watching until the very end. This channel exists because you stay, you engage, and you carry these stories forward. Subscribe to the channel right now. Hit the like button. Send this video to someone who needs to hear it. You just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. Watch it immediately to continue your journey into the dark history of our world. Do not break the chain. Step into the next chapter.